This podcast is a part of the Garnett Media Group podcast network. Garnett Media Group is the official partnership between student-run media outlets at the University of South Carolina. For more information on GMG podcasts or other student work, visit garnettmedia.org. Hi, my name is Dr. Jabari Evans, and welcome to Uncommon Naledge, the podcast where we talk about all things spanning race and representation within mass media. This podcast is a partnership between the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of South Carolina and Garnett Media Group. So without further ado, let's get into this week's episode. So I'm happy to have you on the show as a guest, right? The last time that I actually saw you in person, I feel like we weren't peers yet. You were still finishing your diss. And, you know, everybody really was excited about your project, excited about the work that you're doing. Actually, I feel like I was at your defense.
You were there.
And that may have been the last time that we've actually spoken face to face, even if this is virtual. You know, but a lot has happened since then. You know, a lot has happened professionally for you, I imagine, but there's also a lot that's happened in our world.
Right.
And as somebody who really hangs their hat on critical race theory as being like such a major part of your work and the way that you approach your scholarship, I guess this is a two-part question. A, have you felt at any moment that you've been targeted in this time for the ways in which folks are kind of like really attacking DEI in this climate? And then I guess B would be like, what initially drew you to CRT as a mode of sort of looking at the things that you study?
Absolutely. First of all, I'm so happy to speak to you, Dr. Evans, right? Knowing you in that capacity, having you in that space as a professor was just so amazing for me as a student.
I caught the tail end. If I was there earlier, I felt like I would have been on your committee if I could have.
Absolutely. Oh, if I could have hopped you on then, I would have. But actually, I'll say when I was a doc student in the program, I was experiencing some dynamics in the newsroom, right? So that's what really led me to going into the space, right? Being a journalist and trying to understand the dynamics of why am I the only one in this space? What are these editorial processes where I feel silenced? And so that's what led me to get into that program in the first place. But I found while I was exploring the literature, I really didn't have the words, the ideas, the concepts that really spoke to what I was feeling as a Black woman, as it relates to these dynamics of race and representation in our narrative. Until I took a critical race theory course in the education department. And I felt finally, for the first time, I had the language. I can point to the literature. I can point to the scholars like Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, to validate what I was experiencing and what I can really illustrate as a qualitative scholar. So that's what really drew me to critical race theory. I said, I finally was seen. I finally found the scholarship and the literature that can really express those dynamics. And in terms of being attacked, I feel like the moment that critical race theory was being discussed in mainstream media, I took it personally, right? Because there's just overall ignorance as to really what this concept is about. It's not only an intellectual framework, it's a movement. And I think the reason why it was become so weaponized is because when people are ignorant of things, they are fearful. And that wisdom, enlightenment, that critical race concepts really illustrates and demonstrates to us, people are scared to touch, right? And so when we saw those conversations happening, when we had these conversations about whether it's being taught in K through 12 education, all of this is fallacies, right? It just validated to me why it's even more important to exercise these concepts in my scholarship and to really shine a light on why these conversations are certainly necessary.
Yeah. No, I mean, I remember in your dissertation, the part that I really enjoyed was that, anything that includes hip hop in any sort of way, my ears are going to get a little bit piqued, right? But I think the one thing that you did, not only in applying, what you're talking about with CRT to music,
Mm.
But overall, I think you were applying it to storytelling, right?
Yes.
And I think that sort of for me was the I guess the aha moment in terms of like I see critical race theory being deployed in a lot of different disciplines, and
Right.
a lot of folks have created new theories that, like I just read a paper about critical race media literacy, right? And
Right.
so,
Right.
attaching that onto a lot of different things is a useful way to sort of approach the discussion of race.
Absolutely.
Right now, I'm teaching a course on hip hop that sort of is thinking about hip hop's impact
Mm.
on media
Yeah.
and the way in which blackness is represented.
Right.
Long-winded way of getting to the point, right? But this week we're thinking about hip hop feminism,
Mm.
and we covered Joan Morgan's work that's now 30 years old, and I'm wondering, you know, what do you think about the idea that the black woman's experience in storytelling
Mm.
um, being so integral to telling our stories?
Mm.
Um, why does that go sort of uncredited or
Mm.
unnoted? Um, and I want to get your thoughts on this because this is a conversation that was just being had yesterday in the classroom, and I was really, as I'm lecturing, I was thinking about it. Like a lot of the instances where we're crediting something to black folk innovating, black folk
Mhm.
uh, doing social movements, black folk, blah blah blah. A lot of times, when you get down to the nitty gritty of the history of it, it's women
Yeah.
that are
Yeah.
doing the storytelling, the talking, the tweeting, the
Mhm.
the hashtagging, the memeing. All of that seems to be innovated in many ways by black women. And that story often doesn't get told in that way. And I'm
Absolutely.
wondering how you feel about, this idea of, I guess, not necessarily a hip hop feminism, but a new way of broaching, I guess, storytelling that thinks specifically about how black women tell stories that seem to reach the masses in interesting ways and represent the culture and represent black people, but it
Right.
often doesn't get framed in that way, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, as Black women, we are often overlooked and undermined.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that has become normalized in society in general. And so the beauty of a scholar like Kimberly Crenshaw, recognizing that feminism, right, this feminist
Mm-hmm.
ideals were not centered around Black women's experiences, right? They're focused on
Mm-hmm.
white women, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
we had to kind of galvanize ourselves and to really understand these are some intersectional oppressions that are hindering us as a people, though we are great minds that are making great contributions to this society.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes, I even check myself as a practicing journalist and understanding that oftentimes storytelling is centered upon those ideals, those stories that have been normalized in society. So, who are
Mm-hmm.
these people, these individuals that we often uplift, right? We often uplift those who are white. We often uplift voices that are male.
Mm-hmm.
And so, even me as a journalist, I've been even more intentional when I'm talking about stories of Black experiences.
Right.
I'm ensuring that I'm focusing on how, as Black women, have we inserted ourselves in society, have always contributed greatly to movements of society,
Yeah.
and how can I help uplift their voices through not only my practice as a journalist, but through the scholarship. And
Mm.
so I think the answer to that is more intentionality in doing so, giving
Yeah.
more credit to the Kimberly Crenshaws of the world, giving more
Mm-hmm.
credit to the Bell Hooks of our world.
Mm-hmm.
I introduce my students the first day of class, when there's second week of class, I have them reading Letter from the Birmingham Jail, and I have them listening and watching I Have a Dream, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
it's not just because it's Dr. King, but we're having this conversation about how our identities, our lived experiences really frame who we are as a people. But
Mm-hmm.
their next reading is Bell Hooks, right?
Right.
And so these students don't know who Bell Hooks is, but I have them reading a chapter about critical thinking, how
Yeah.
she's saying we should enter this space with childlike ideals and being
Mm-hmm.
open to new experiences and people's perspectives. And so for me as a Black woman, that makes me feel good to
Mm.
introduce 250 plus undergrads to Bell Hooks, a
Yeah.
powerful Black woman who's contributed so greatly to our society and its knowledge. And it's not until they got into this space that they were presented with that. And so I think for me, I am trying to be more intentional with doing that with my students because it's all about training and teaching the next generation. And I think that is the way that we can correct that, right? We
Mm.
need to be more intentional with opening up those spaces and having these conversations. Because, like you said, critical race theory, I focus on the aspect of storytelling.
Yeah.
And as content creators, that is what we do. So,
Mm.
how are we contributing to the harm? Right? These ideals, these stereotypes that have invested in our
Yep.
society as relates to Black women and their space and place in society.
Yep.
And then how can we offer a space and an avenue for conversations like this
Mm.
and recognizing and honoring them for those great contributions as well?
It's interesting you brought up stereotypes because that's where I was
Mm.
going.
Hmm.
And it's also interesting you brought up Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks, I was talking about her in two different contexts
Yeah.
yesterday.
Mm.
One was, this idea of the oppositional gaze that she sort of puts forth about like when I see black women on screen, I immediately know that the folks who constructed this have a vision that isn't aligned with
Yeah.
what I know black womanhood to be, right? So it's almost like she talks about more being more interested in watching white cinema or white
Mm.
sitcoms or things that just don't involve blackness because she can read it with uh I guess a critical eye that isn't offended, right?
Absolutely.
Whereas when
Absolutely.
black women are attempted, even just from a representation standpoint, to be shown on screen or inserted into stories,
Mhm.
often it's from that lens of like caricatures or things that
Yes.
kind of represent black women in ways that are not authentic.
Absolutely.
On the flip side of that, Bell Hooks, before her passing, called Beyonce out for
Absolutely.
when Lemonade comes out. And so,
Hmm.
we were having this conversation. On the one hand, I'm like, you have to know Bell Hooks. You have to respect Bell Hooks. You have to know that foundationally, if we're going to talk black feminism, she's the
Yes.
preeminent
Yes.
scholar of that space.
Right.
However,
Yes.
in a hip hop class, we can
Mm.
also talk about how there's these respectability politics
Yeah.
that maybe younger people don't have the same fervor for in terms of their version of feminism. Uh,
Yeah.
I say all that to say, like, women are kind of at the forefront of hip hop culture right now,
Hmm.
in many ways, or at least that's what folks are
Hmm.
saying, right? Is that women are kind of doing the most interesting things or the most innovative things in hip hop right now. And I'm wondering, though, if that popular feminism that sort of is being placed into the zeitgeist, do you feel like in some ways it's sort of cloaked in patriarchy, or do you feel
Oh,
as though this empowerment and the way it's being even sold to us,
yeah.
is that, in your eyes, I mean, I guess it's always a good thing to see black people win, but is there a skeptic in you when you see these things sort of taking shape in the culture?
Mm. Oh, that's a great question.
Hmm.
Um, Last week, I'm teaching a critical race theory and communications course with my grad students.
Hmm.
And I feel like every week we talk about, at the end of the day, it boils down to capitalism. It's all about the money, it's all about the green. And I feel like they hear me say that all the time. So in my realism kind of mind frame, I think about that aspect and how it's a
Hmm.
business, and hip hop is a business as much as
Hmm.
it's an art form, and
Right.
how much it's impacted our culture. And I think about these great hip hop artists and these Black women that are taking the forefront. And part of that is the image that is attached to it. Part of these hip hop artists and their personas is the storytelling, not only through their lyrics, but in their persona as individuals. And
Hmm.
so part of me thinks about that idea of patriarchy and how much of this is, of course, is leaning into the business aspect and being profitable and selling them as an image
Yeah.
altogether.
Yep.
But then also the other part of me is also celebrating the beauty in just embracing their Blackness and
Mm.
feminism and their sexuality
Hmm.
and owning it through their lyrics and their
Hmm.
presence, whether on the red carpet, Meg Thee Stallion got a lot of uproar for what she was wearing to the
Yeah.
Oscars after party, but that's Meg Thee Stallion, like you go,
Yeah.
girl. So it's there's nuances to it. And
Hmm.
I think the beauty and taking a step back, I'm I am happy to see that Black women are taking the forefront. Not only they've always been there, right? But we
Right.
are embracing them more so than we did the Queen Latifahs and MC Lights. Like
Yeah.
we are embracing and allowing them to take these pedestals. So, the cynic in me thinks about the money, the capitalism, and what that paints in terms of our culture and our society. But then also we're giving them this space and we're honoring them in these spaces. And I appreciate how Black media outlets like The Essence and The
Hmm.
Roots are also celebrating them for really
Yeah.
taking up space as they should.
I had a conversation on this podcast with Catherine Knight Steele.
Mm,
She's at University of Maryland. She just wrote a book maybe a year ago
mm,
called Digital Black Feminism.
mm,
And we were talking and discussing about the idea of how in digital spaces,
mm,
Black women and Black queer folk are drivers of trends in
mm.
many ways, often even in terms of like the visual aesthetics of memes.
Yeah.
Uh, we where white folk can appropriate Blackness in ways that they can't do in the physical world.
Yes.
A white woman or a white man can put Nene Leakes up as
Mhm,
a as a
mhm.
meme and it works, and it's just like that's internet culture. We understand what that is. Or there's a lot of famous images that get remixed in internet culture, and often we kind of just lose the idea that it was started or invented or has roots in Black communities. But I think in many ways, Black women have used social media platforms to a T, right? And have used that influence to become sort of champions in legacy media as well. I'm wondering from a news standpoint,
Mm.
I guess as a scholar as well as a journalist, how has social media sort of played into your ability to sort of A, find your voice, and B, find your audience?
Mm. Oh, that's such great. That's such a great question. Like it wouldn't be. Um, yes, thank you for asking that. The beauty of social media, especially when we talk about Black culture and how
Hmm.
it's often appropriated, and we instantly take ownership of who we are and our narratives
Right.
by our ability to present it to the world on our own, right? By
Hmm.
putting ourselves out there, right? Without that interference. Um, for me as a journalist, it's interesting because I often I use social media strictly for professional reasons. So like Twitter
Hmm.
X, we just gonna call it Twitter X.
Hmm.
I would share my stories, but I was very cautious as to anything that I may post or say that align with my own personal ideals or beliefs.
Did it for
I
these? Okay.
knew that I wanted to use it strictly for let me share these stories. Let me talk about these narratives to people in our communities. And so, I didn't leverage it in a way outside of that, but I
Hmm.
can admit, transitioning from that space of being a practicing journalist to now as a scholar, I have seen how social media has shifted, has transitioned, and how things have been weaponized in these spaces. So I was outside of that space when we're seeing April Ryan getting attacked, right?
Mm.
I'm outside of this space when I'm seeing these Black women that are holding prominent positions on mainstream television are being removed and silenced. And so naturally, there's this new shift in this new movement that I can appreciate as a journalist and understanding how we still need these Black women in these spaces. But now, as a scholar, I'm watching the patterns and the behavior, and
Hmm.
I honestly feel because of women like that who have owned their voices in those spaces, If I was still a journalist now, I would have even more confidence to speak up. I would
Hmm.
feel even more empowered to say, hey, this isn't right.
Hmm.
And I think it's unfortunately because of the dynamics of what we are seeing, what's happened recently, and how just Black women are being attacked for doing their jobs. Um, so yeah, and I think that, we're talking about the respectability politics, right?
Hmm.
And thinking that I'm representing this, I'm representing the Associated Press, and and
Yeah.
and again, keeping in mind that I was like the only one that looked like me in those spaces,
Right.
right? So I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, I don't want to do anything or say anything that looks crazy. I
Yeah.
don't want to do anything that can diminish the brand, right? And
Right.
those are all things we have to deal with working in these systems,
Yeah.
that remove some sense of authenticity that I tried to find through the exercising of my storytelling,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah.
can't necessarily say this, but I'm gonna find the people, the communities, the policies that speak to what I'm feeling as a
Sure.
Black. And that's how I tried to address it.
Mm. I'm standing right here in Columbia, a place that you know very well. And
Yeah.
you're a three-time graduate
I
of
am.
USC.
Yes. Yes.
So, I mean, I think coming here, I've learned a lot about the politics of South Carolina, with the
Absolutely.
state building kind of being right here. And there's some interesting characters as well as, kind of there's some interesting characters, but there's also a culture of how things work around here. And I'm wondering, it as a journalist, how has being from here sort of shaped the way in which you cover stories, the way in which you tell stories, as well as how you even maneuver rooms with certain types of individuals.
Yeah. Yes. Three-time grad of the University of South Carolina. Um, Yeah. As a student, it's funny because I started out in the sciences. So this is journalism
Yeah,
was like
I
second
saw
career,
that. I
right? I
saw that.
shifted from wanting to be in the medical field. And then I took my first journalism
Mm.
class when I was getting my master's degree with Dr. Kevin Hull in his class, and I
Mm.
fell in love with it. But naturally, being in South Carolina, in the South, at the University of South Carolina, you know you're Black
Mm-hmm.
walking in these classes, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are daily experiences that remind you as to the environment that you are operating in.
Right.
I've always come from a family. I'm a military kid, Army brat, and
Mm-hmm.
so excellence is the expectation.
For sure.
Right. And so in every space that I operated in, I'm like, I have to be the greatest that I can be, not to
Mm.
prove anybody wrong or to prove a point, but that's just the nature of how I was brought up.
That's
Right.
the standard.
And so
Mm-hmm.
that is the standard. That is the bare
Mm-hmm.
minimum, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so as going from a student and working in the spaces to transitioning to a practicing journalist, it hit different, right?
Mm.
You said interesting characters, I would work covering the state house policies, had lawmakers who
Mm-hmm.
refused to interview with me. I had
Mm.
lawmakers that would call a colleague and I had credentials and all,
Oh
but
wow.
tried to verify who I was as an individual. People refused to answer my calls, my emails. And so
Hmm.
I had to learn to work the system, right?
Mm.
I had individuals in that space who, you know, were so honored and proud to see me there. So they would
Okay.
help me get the answers that I needed. And so I really appreciated that sense of camaraderie in that space. But it motivated me in a different way
Okay.
because I knew that the stories, and I'm so grateful that I had the pleasure, working with the Associated Press. They gave me the liberty to tell the stories that I thought were important.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I felt a great sense of responsibility to not just, of course, I'm speaking to people across the state of South Carolina and individuals outside the state who are very invested in what was happening here.
Mm-hmm.
But in the back of my mind, I was focusing on stories that impacted my community, the
Okay.
Black people in these spaces, right? And I can honestly say, working there and even with the state newspaper, I was working with the state newspaper when I was finishing my PhD. When I took critical race theory courses, that informed my writing as a journalist.
Mm.
And I feel like made me a stronger storyteller
Mm.
because I was able to take a few steps back to really kind of analyze the dynamics of the story. So, for
Mm.
example, I wrote a story about Native American chiefs and like this arduous process of filling out government paperwork to validate and prove who they are so they can be recognized by the state as a tribe, right?
Wow.
But the essence of the story is identity and having to
Hmm.
prove themselves to a system that stole from them in the first place, right? So this
Mm.
very twisted cycle of oppression and silencing that these native groups continue to have to endure because of how the governmental system has been formed. And so I was able to dig into these stories in very nuanced ways that allow me to apply crit concepts to provide a stronger sense and understanding of the dynamics that were happening in the state of South Carolina. And those are certainly, from what I've heard, have been the strongest, the stories that have touched people the most. And that was when I was able to leverage this knowledge in the academic space and bring it into my storytelling. And so
Mm.
all that to say is, I am proud to be Black. I'm proud to be a Black woman. I am proud to call South Carolina home, even though I was born in Germany. But I'm proud to call South Carolina home. And for me, despite what I was experiencing trying to do my job,
Mm.
I knew a job had to be done because I always said, if I'm not telling these stories, who will? Because from my experience, they weren't being told. That was my motivator.
Mm. What's a major misconception about South Carolina now that you're outside of South Carolina now? I remember moving here and you get like differences of opinion on like where you're going, or folks who never have been there who already have had opinions about the South or just South Carolina. Um, what have you found is a major misconception about South Carolina, even amongst this Black community? What is a major misconception?
Oh man.
I'm sure that's a
Amongst,
loaded question, but
no,
I
I'm glad when you said amongst the Black community,
yeah.
there's a difference there.
Hmm.
Amongst those in the Black community who have no connections to the South, when I say I'm from South Carolina, I hate to use this reference, but Confederate flag, right? They
Yes.
think about, KKK like that, right?
Hmm.
Automatic.
Yeah.
Um, People who are familiar with the South or from the South and moved up here,
Hmm.
the conversations are often framed around it's a different kind of racism up here.
Mm.
And
Mm.
honestly, I'm like, you're right, right? Like for me, it's there are things that are very overt and in the South that you deal with, and you're like, okay, whatever, I'm in South
Yeah.
Carolina, it's part for the core, it rolls off your shoulder, it doesn't bother you, right?
Hmm.
It's just,
Hmm.
this is home. I understand the dynamics of the space.
Yeah.
But as someone that is a transplant into another space where I am in a predominantly white space,
Right.
there's nuances to that
There is.
racism,
There is.
right? It's not so overt.
Hmm.
It's kind of like you had to take okay, did I receive
Hmm.
that? And so my
Hmm.
conversations with people in the Black community are always aligning with that, right? No,
Yeah.
what you're mentioning, you're right. You're right. It's not necessarily so blunt,
Hmm.
but you know what that feels like in those dynamics. And so that's certainly the conversations that are framed around the difference from living in the South
Yeah.
versus being here in the Midwest, things being
Hmm.
overt versus kind of, nuance in terms of these dynamics, racial dynamics and things of that nature. Um, and sometimes one thing I can say though, a difference is as a professor, having the opportunity to teach courses at South Carolina and coming here,
Hmm.
I do should feel a difference with my student interaction.
Right.
And I think it is largely because, and from what I've been told, they don't have an opportunity to see me
Mm.
in spaces like that. It's very rare that they will have a Black professor. So there's a different sense of, I hate to say all, but a
Hmm.
lot of them are like impressed. Like,
Right.
like I would have conversations with students at the end of the semester and how they were happy to be a part of my course and they didn't
Right.
realize what they would get from this course
Hmm.
and them admitting that they've never had a Black professor
Hmm.
before. And so the frequency and or occurrence for students in South Carolina having a Black professor versus where I am in this space is
Hmm.
different.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, it's a different sense of ownership students have when they're exposed to the kind of content that I'm trying to share with them. And I sense there's certainly a difference, a regional difference. And yeah, there's a lot of nuances and dynamics there, but always when I'm getting my hair done, I'm going so I see Black people, that's always the conversation of, you're from South Carolina? Tell me about that. And
Yeah.
it always leans into ideas of what racism looks like.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I
No.
often say, like, look, I say I'm proud to say South Carolina. Hold it.
Hmm.
I love my state. I love the cultures that are represented in these spaces. I love the beauty of the state and how we can go to the coast and celebrate and honor our
Yeah.
ancestors who once brought to these coasts, but now we can honor
Hmm.
them through a museum. There's so much beauty and nuances to the state, and that kind of speaks to the stereotypical ideas. I'm not from the sticks, I'm from
Yeah.
South
Yeah.
Carolina, right?
Yeah.
Ways I try to shift the conversation away from that, but it admittedly it always leans into race and experiences with racism.
It's very real. I mean, just as much as, the story of trauma and,
Yeah,
us getting to this land
yeah,
is the focal point of a lot of my conversations about South Carolina. I think what I've found and what I've learned over maybe the last 4 years is there's also this history of like Black excellence that comes from South Carolina as well. A lot of like the first
yeah,
freedmen, the
yeah.
first like Black, 100,000 heirs and business owners. And there's like a legacy of that too that
Yes.
doesn't often really get talked about, but it would make sense
Yeah.
that the place that surrounds where we originally might have landed
Hmm.
would then also have, individuals who will operate and eventually become independent, right? Under the, whatever arrangements that were initially had when they get here.
Yeah.
But I think that gets lost in the shuffle. It's like everybody in America has to start from somewhere, right?
Right.
And so for all of us, for all intents and purposes, that is somewhere in the South. And
Yes.
so I think the way we tell the story with perspective, I may not have had that perspective
Hmm.
if I hadn't, gone to Mississippi with my dad during
Right.
during summers or gone to Alabama to see my mother's family. Like if I didn't do those things, I don't think I would have had any perspective on it. But
Right.
living down here, you really get to see and experience the South in a different way, where
Yes.
folks start telling these stories, or you start realizing that there's individuals who have certain last names, and those last names matter, and they go really far back, and there's a real proudness, and I was like, oh, okay, wow, okay, that the flip side of some of these traditions that we have in the Black community, a lot of that is started here, literally here, not this state, right? And so I think that's a one thing I took away from, what I've taken away from my experience. Piggybacking off of that, though, I think perspective, identity,
Yeah.
as well as kind of like being your authentic self as a storyteller,
Yeah.
is at a premium right now.
Absolutely.
But journalism often,
Hmm.
places at the forefront objectivity.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
you probably know where I'm going with this, but I'm wondering, as someone who is teaching those who want to make media and be storytellers, how do you go about even, talking about objectivity? Like it, in and of itself is sometimes it feels like objectivity, or neutrality is almost teaching teaching to go against one's
Yeah.
perspective, right? In a time where maybe that perspective is needed. So how do you go about kind of teaching that or talking about it or having dialogue with students about how to deploy
Mhm.
or not employ their identities in the things that they write?
Absolutely. Well, I want to say first, you made such beautiful points in terms of what we were talking about before, and I just wanted to say this too. You
Hmm.
know, Part of the title of my dissertation was Power, Poison, Pain, and Joy, talking
Mm,
about Kendrick Lamar. And so all that it is of the Black experience is the pain, is the drama, but there's
mm,
joy and there's that
yeah.
beauty and excellence. So I love how you made that point of how there's so much to celebrate in terms of Black excellence that is rooted in individuals who are from South Carolina.
Yeah.
And that is often lost in conversations, but that's part of our experiences. It's all the things that
Mm.
make us who we are and make us resilient. Um, Objectivity. I do not teach that in my class.
Okay.
I start my semester to
Just
say,
like
throw it
scrap
out the
that.
window.
Scrap that.
What is that? Like, I was like, how can we be objective, right? And I said, but we can be fair in our reporting.
Mm,
And
yeah.
there's ways that we can
Mm,
approach our work as journalists because I don't want I tell my students all the time, like, let me keep it all the way real.
okay.
I tell them, and again, with the framework of where I'm from as a Black woman,
Mm,
I said, there are experiences and ways that I can tell stories that are relevant to what I experience as a Black woman. That doesn't negate the fact that I can still be fair and truthful in my reporting.
mm,
There's nuances to it, right? There's
mm.
cultural familiarity. And
Yep.
so I tell my students to lean into their lived experiences to help them approach their storytelling techniques. Now, again, with that being said, we have a conversation like the first week in all of my courses about the social identity wheel.
Okay.
Let's look at all of our identities. Let's have a conversation about what are some identities that are more salient? What are some that are more top of mind? So I
Mm,
model that. Top of mind is my ethnicity. It is my race. It is my gender. It is my faith, right? Those are things that are very important to me, top of mind. You
right.
know, I'm fortunate to be in a position that education isn't top of mind to me, but that's part of my identity.
Mm-hmm.
This idea of economics, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I first of all have a conversation about that, and I tell them, you have a very unique voice that you can offer us through your storytelling. Don't
Mm,
shun that.
mm,
Don't strip that away because we are all unique individuals. And so in terms of teaching journalistic practice, we start from that point
mm,
because I need my students to understand that I am not asking something that is unrealistic and that is not human.
mm.
That is inhumane to think that we can be perfectly down the center. I said, but at the same time, let me help give you some strategies or techniques so that if you have certain political ideologies, they're not manifested in your storytelling.
Okay.
Right? This is not negating you from talking to someone who may have opposing political beliefs. Because
Mm,
now I tell my students, not only am I teaching them to be professional communicators, ready to, work in this field, but I'm trying to mold them into engaged citizens of this world.
mm,
So how can we be engaged citizens if we're not informed and not only not informed of what is happening in the world around us, but not informing ourselves of what our own biases are? What are those blind spots? Confront
yeah.
them. It's okay to have them. Because I know this now, how do I approach this work? So I throw it out the window. I tell my objective, no, I'm telling you now, I told this story about this community because, for this reason, I wrote stories about HBCUs because we only heard about them when there was a question of crime or
Yeah.
financial woes, right? Bump that. Let's talk about the great things that are happening. I did that because I am proud to be Black.
Yes.
I embrace that and I want that to show through my storytelling.
Mm. That being said, though, I've also been to a lot of panels,
Mm.
conferences,
Hmm.
convenings that are really concerned about the death of journalism
Hmm.
in some way, shape, or form. And it's a really, I don't know. I think sometimes that title is thrown out there to sort of bring people in. I
Yeah.
think similarly to when, Nas said hip hop is dead,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Right.
That was to make a statement, not that it actually was dead. And I think very similarly, I don't know if anyone really thinks that journalism is
Yes.
going to die, but
Yeah.
like in a landscape where we now have artificial intelligence,
Mm. Mm.
in a landscape where individuals aren't necessarily, and I've had several conversations on this podcast about it, where folks just aren't reading the same way. They are reading, but they aren't reading the same way that maybe folks who are millennials or even uh, some Gen Z, older
Right.
Gen Z folk, they aren't reading the same way. And so Excuse me. With all that said, how then do we encourage young people
Mm,
to find careers in this space, let alone to find their voice?
mm.
Are you finding that that conversation is becoming in any way more difficult than maybe it once was, even a year or two ago?
Right. Yes. Short answer to
Short
that.
answer.
Short answer, yes. I always try to remind my students that being a journalist is a very honorable profession, especially in these days when it is being attacked and it's
Mm,
coming from all sides,
yeah.
from people that have a platform and a voice, and then just from regular individuals who
Mm,
have Twitter X thumbs or feel
right.
like they can say anything to you via email.
YouTube channels,
YouTube
podcasts,
channel,
all of
oh my
that. Yeah.
gosh, talking heads, right?
Yeah.
Um, I still remind them this is an honorable profession because there is great power in words.
Hmm.
And there is great power in having the ability to reach people and connect with them in ways where they feel seen,
Mm,
in ways that AI cannot do,
yeah.
in ways that people who have this great platform on YouTube that may have these large followings cannot do. There are journalists who are living in the communities that they serve. And so, my the biggest conversations around that, of course, is about the money.
Right.
That's always, these young people, I sound so old, these young people, they want to come into the game making a certain amount of money, right? They want the money.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I always, center those conversations around purpose. And
Mm,
for me, I've always felt my purpose in life has been to make a profound impact on other people's lives, right? So for me, as an undergrad, it was like sciences. I thought I was going to go into the medical field, right? That was the direction I was going until I found journalism.
mm,
And I realized I've been able to touch people through my words in ways that I know I couldn't have individually done with my patients, right? Still making an impact, right? But
right.
I feel like it's been exceptionally larger numbers because the way that it works as a journalist. You
Mm,
can instantly send your stories to people. People from across the world were reading my stories as a journalist. And even now, as a professor, making a profound impact in terms of me training the next generation of journalists. So, my approach to it is always instilling to them your why is the importance in the essence of what you do and how it's not about you as an individual, but how you're
mm,
contributing to society and solidifying these stories and directly combating these attacks that we are facing as professions. And there's always talks about journalistic practice. We have like citizen journalists, individuals who call themselves
yep.
journalists, the
Yep.
actual, things of that nature. But I feel like that as a profession, we have to continue to reinvent ourselves to meet the digital spaces to which we can share our stories. Um,
Mm,
but there's nothing like the journalists who are sitting in those policy meetings, who are on the ground at the state house, who are in the city council meetings, who are there in those spaces. And I think there will always be space and honor and recognition for that,
hmm.
for individuals who truly understand and appreciate it. And I think on a larger scale, if we're looking at the MSNBC, CNNs, Fox News of the world, that is missed. But when we truly take a moment to take a few steps back and look at the role of our local journalists,
Mm.
that's where we can really appreciate the work that is being done. They don't hover in and leave after the tragedy. They
That's
live
legit.
here. They
Yeah.
breathe this. And I
Yeah.
think that's what's going to continue to make journalism as a practice and a profession viable. You
Mm,
can't get that any other way.
mm, mm. I guess on the flip side of it, I've done a lot of asking you about journalism,
Yeah.
right? But you are a scholar and you
Mm,
are, accomplished on that side of the fence as well. What are some of the current things that you're pursuing in your scholarly work? And what directions are you excited about in terms of your research?
absolutely. So thank you for asking me that. So I looking at crit, of course, as a lens to which I
Mm-hmm.
approach all of my work. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of my work has focused in on how Black communicators have either helped or caused harm in terms of our narratives as a people.
Mm,
And so there's a project I'm finishing up now. There's one part of the project we already finished as a group, but we're looking at Black conservatives
mm,
and what ideas, what nuances, how are they leveraging Black rhetoric, proximity to speak to
mm.
certain policies and or ideologies that are actually harmful to us as a people, right? So how are
Mhm.
they communicating, connecting to individuals in our community and that kind of harm that is being caused? So I'm analyzing that right now, and there's some startling things that I'm seeing, and a lot of it is aligned with the murders of individuals in our society and how those deaths are being leveraged as a tool to kind of speak negatively about our experiences. So we're talking about the George Floyds of the world and really questioning
Mhm.
him and this idea of how have we been celebrating this individual? Is that the appropriate thing we should be doing as a Black community? So that's a very
Yeah.
interesting dynamic that I'm experiencing in terms of Black conservatives and their spaces in YouTube and how they're leveraging that to continue to really harm our communities by speaking to policies that have been detrimental to us as a people.
Mm.
So that's one thing I'm looking at. I continue to study music because I love music.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I have a
Mhm.
paper that I'm finishing up now as well. It's funny. I had the privilege of talking about Kendrick Lamar's halftime show, and I
Oh.
I think one thing that was intriguing about outside of just the storytelling around it was I was focusing on the discourse within the Black community,
Mm. Mm.
right? And I was observing it on Twitter X.
Yep.
And it brought to question and brought to mind about how we go back and forth as a community in terms of critiquing our people and our
Mhm.
artistry and who we are as an individuals. And I'm thinking about the people that are outside of this space who are watching this discourse that are happening with inner communities. And I feel and what I observe and what I want to learn about is how that kind of discourse is feeding the policies and or um, really stoking the sense of anti-Blackness that are in these
Mm.
other spaces because they're seeing the dynamics within our own discourse and the lack of
Mm.
unity per se.
Mm.
So I'm not quite sure the direction I'm gonna go with that, but I always find it curious and I always question how does Black discourse, how does discourse within our community feed ideals and feed strategies and policies that are used to harm us as a people, right? How do people see the lack of unity and use that as a way to kind of further any of their purposes or ideals? Probably could have said that in a more articulate manner, but
Mhm.
that's something I'm certainly curious about. And I have that model from my dissertation that I've been using to apply with my own autoethnography that I hope to have out soon that really talks about my experiences as a journalist. I hope to take that further beyond an academic paper because I think it's
Mhm.
certainly something that could needs to be discussed and talked about, but
Mm.
really using crit as praxis and not being ashamed to do so, right?
Mm.
How can we continue to bring crit into the classroom as a way to apply its ideals, to apply its concepts and our understanding of our practices as professional communicators, as journalists?
Mm.
So that's a few things that I'm working on. I feel like my hands are in so many pots. I'm always, I'm working on something now about Black appropriation and the commodification of Black bodies when it comes with the
Mm.
California raisins. So I'm always
Mm.
looking for ways to which to exercise this crit lens, but at the end of the
Right.
day, bring it back to my people.
Mm.
And to answer your question of where I want to go from there, I feel like all of that work kind of leans into just it's heavy at times to
Yeah.
constantly look at how we're oppressed and harmed and
Mhm.
things of that nature. So
Mhm.
I want to shift towards more joy-filled work. Um,
Mm.
and I'm still processing how I will use that, but I think it's important to say while saying that is why Black owned media, digital media spaces are so necessary because that's where we're going to find those intentional joy-filled narratives of who we are as a people.
Mm.
And so that's where I want to take my work toward because I always say that I want my work to breathe outside of academia. I don't
Hmm.
like it's not enough for my colleagues or peers to be in the academic journal. That's
Right.
great. It's great for tenure. But the reality of the situation is I want the people that I'm talking about to be impacted by it. So that's why community engaged work is so important for me. That's why, I did the hip hop panel because it's not only we're talking about these amazing Michigan-based journal musicians like Mama Soul, but
Hmm.
this is an opportunity to expose my students to the art of storytelling through music and how hip hop should be embraced as more than just a genre, but it's a way of life and something we should honor and celebrate. And I'm finding I'm able to do that through community engaged work. So I have my hands in many pots, all of
That's how
it.
it goes on the track.
That's
That's
how,
how it
listen,
is.
I'm trying to balance. I'm trying to be like you, Dr. Evans. You know what I'm saying? I'm trying to be like
No,
you.
don't be
But
don't be like me. I'm not balanced at all. I just stopped saying no to things, and now I need
yeah,
to start saying no to things. And so,
yeah,
but
yeah,
for sure, having your hands and things that can ultimately be what I call a twofer
yeah.
is how I kind of describe it. Is like it's okay. They're gonna make me do this, but how
Mm,
can I make this fit into this other thing, right? Or,
yeah, yeah.
even this conversation we're having today, it's like this is scholarship, right?
Right,
Doesn't
right.
always have to feel or look like the thing that's in the journal or the thing that's at the conference, but engaging even in I have a friend, A.D. Carson. He's at UVA, and he says, anytime I engage in conversation with someone else who's doing the same thing I'm doing, there is going to be something substantive that
Yes.
comes from that. And so I think the podcast has been a way to sort of document these conversations in ways where it can count in some way as creative scholarship. But the things that we say and do,
Mm,
figuring out how to make them count in and of itself is a part of this meritocracy that we're in.
yes. Absolutely.
And that's troublesome, but
Yes.
they train us to do that in grad school.
Absolutely. It's a cycle. It is a cycle,
you
and
know,
it's become so normalized, invested, but we have to understand the way that the academy looked then continues
hmm
to shift every day. And we as a people are creative people.
yeah, that part,
And we
that
find
part.
our ways and avenues to share our work.
There's a real
And so when
tradition
we
in
talk,
that. Yep,
yes. And
there's a
so when
real
we talk
tradition.
about impact, what do we mean by impact?
Yeah.
The fact that you're being interviewed by, I'm grateful for BBC to talk about Kendrick Lamar
hmm
and like what he gave us in that halftime show. Like
hmm
that's impact because we're
Yeah.
talking about this work in front of audiences who would not otherwise have the opportunity or knowledge. They're
Yes.
not going to go to these different academic journals to look for us. They want us to meet us where they are.
Yep.
Sorry, I
Yep.
don't.
No, you going in, and I'm appreciative of it because it's like sometimes, again, we have conversations, and particularly if you're perceived to be the person who does race in their
Yeah.
work or in their teaching. And
Yes.
often there's nobody to bounce those
Yeah.
ideas off of or to bounce those conversations off of. So you're expected to sort of, I guess, go out into the world and bring that knowledge back to your
Yes.
departments or to your students. But often it's not done in a way that allows for you to just really bounce things back and forth. What are you seeing where you're at? What are you seeing where you're at? And those conversations are fewer and further in between, even though there's actually a good number of black folk now in the J school. We're just so busy that often those conversations don't end up happening, and silos get created within certain disciplines. But
Yes. Yes.
you mentioned joy, and that's a great segue. It's like
Mhm.
you kind of been hitting
It
on things
does.
that I don't have to ask now. But there's a question I ask every guest,
Yeah.
and it usually is around media, things that we're consuming that bring us joy.
Mm.
And so I'll pose this question to you. Is there any form of media? It doesn't have to necessarily be a TV show or a movie. I've had people mention that they started following someone on Instagram or on TikTok, and that person is, makes them laugh or whatever it is. Is there some form of media? Is there some form of storytelling that you've consumed
Mm.
that is bringing you joy currently? It could be a song, it could be anything.
Oh, come on, song. I feel honestly will always music always instantly just elicits some kind of emotion for me
Mm,
instantly. And so in terms of what brings me joy, it's always been gospel music.
mm,
I start my mornings with gospel. If
okay.
I have to hit it midday in the office, you know. Um, but no, it's always music. Before I start all of my classes, I'm playing music. I
That's
had one
so
student
cool.
say, "Who is that?" I'm like, "That's Bobby Brown."
Yeah.
I introduce people. And I always do that to kind of like, the classroom, that space is always naturally can be intimidating. That dynamic between professor and student. So let's start out with music. Let's kind of break up whatever tension, whatever you may be feeling as we're starting to gather in this space. But for me, I have to pour into myself because we're constantly pouring into others. We're constantly giving of ourselves, right? And the multiple hats that we wear. And so for me, listening to my Daryl Coley's, my Marvin Sapp's of the world, and I'm listening to CeCe Wine and Goodness of God. I'm listening to all of that because that's what keeps me grounded. And that's what keeps me full so that I can in turn give and pour into other people. And so it's certainly music. Music is it's always been that for me.
That's cool. That's cool. Well, I am so thankful we were able to do this. I know we've been talking about making this conversation happen for some time. And I'm happy that it went well and that I got out of this interview more than I could have ever imagined or anticipated. So I'm gonna give you your flowers,
Oh,
Dr. Christina Myers, Michigan State University, but still a Gamecock in heart, right?
always, forever to be, always.
For sure. So that is our episode. I hope you
Thank
all
you.
enjoyed. And another episode of Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Jabari Evans signing out. Peace. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, leave a rating or review. And to catch the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram at KnowledgeSense82 and on Twitter at KnowledgeSense82. Now that's different than how you normally would spell it. That's NALEDGE, since 82, as in 1982. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Peace.